Rick Sanchez from Rick and Morty is one of the most tragic characters in popular media. He is the man who has everything, an intellect beyond comprehension, a family that loves him, and practical immortality, yet despite all of this, he is incredibly miserable. There's a void within Rick, and it's shaped like his ex-wife, Diane, his lost love, and despite all his genius, power, and connections, he's never been able to fill that hole, but that hasn't stopped him from trying. Throughout the series, we do see that Rick has a number of love interests, but none of them ever seem to go anywhere. And this video aims to answer the question, why not? And to answer this question, we'll of course have to talk about spoilers. I will be pulling mainly from these episodes though. And of course, a video like this, much like Rick himself, wouldn't be complete without Diane. Diane is the love of Rick's life and Beth's mother, but we don't actually know that much about her, and that's an intentional choice from the showrunners. We know that Rick loved her very dearly, and that her death and erasure of her memory had a profound effect on Rick, but she's more of a symbol than a living, breathing character. Diane symbolizes everything Rick lost when he became the Rick we know and love. But when Rick Prime took her away from our Rick and deleted every version of her across countless realities, that changed him. Because as you may know, Diane was destroyed through the Omega device, a contraption that kills an individual across every reality, eliminating every single conceivable variant of that person. So even if Rick can hop from universe to universe to escape from the consequences of his actions, he can never escape to one with Diane in it. And that's part of what makes Rick such a tragic character, because the show makes it a point to illustrate that Rick does want to feel loved by someone. He craves a deeper connection, which he attempts to fill through various other romantic partners throughout the series, with the most prominent one being Unity. Rick hooks up with a lot of characters throughout the show, like an alien huntress, a horse person, and even a sentient planet. But one of the most interesting ones by far is an entire hive mind entity that goes by the name of Unity. And for a hive mind, we actually see that Unity is a very interesting character. They have a life goal, which is to be able to assimilate as much of the known universe as possible and to bring peace to worlds that need it. And they were on track to meet with the Galactic Federation to expand their reach even more. That's a desire that's quite admirable for a kind of entity that's typically depicted as evil in most science fiction. But we know that Unity was not always like this. They actually have a history with Rick, and when they first stated, Unity was a completely different entity. They were younger and would use their powers for smaller pursuits, such as allegedly taking over a police station just to get to its evidence locker. But when Rick meets Unity again, he brings them back to the being that they were when they were together. He makes them do drugs, use their power purely for Rick's pleasure, and while they have a lot of fun together, Unity just isn't that kind of hive mind anymore. In fact, the episode goes to show that Rick's presence kind of corrupts Unity, because Rick caused them to go on a bender, during which they lost control of a portion of the alien race they were manipulating, and this subsequently reignites a race war. And Unity realizes how toxic Rick is and ends up dumping him by the end of the episode. They claim that when they're with him, they lose who they are and end up becoming a part of him. And the C-plot in this episode confirms that this is a pattern with Rick, because while Rick, Morty, Summer, and Unity are off on their own shenanigans, Beth and Jerry are at home arguing over Rick's intentions. And Jerry has a real critique of Beth, claiming that she's willing to go through such lengths to defend her father, even if it means putting him and their children at stake. Rick's narcissism is toxic because it bleeds into the people who love him, like Unity and Beth. And ultimately, Unity points to Rick's aversion to growth as the reason they can't be anything more. And this breaks Rick so much to the point where he's willing to off himself. And this sadly confirms what Unity said to be true. When faced with the fact that his ex-lover doesn't want him because he cannot change, instead of working on himself, he immediately seeks escape through the sweet release of death. Rick runs away from his emotions rather than processing, and that's why his romance with Unity ultimately failed. But that's not the only encounter he has with the hive mind. They appear once more 5 seasons later, and all Unity wants to do is talk to Rick about his quest to hunt down Rick Prime, but he just doesn't want to hear them out. In the time they haven't spoken, Rick devised a special kind of gas that immediately releases anyone under control of a hive mind, and it's a weapon ultimately devised specifically for entities like his ex-lover, Unity. Rick in this episode just doesn't want anything to do with them, likely because they shot him down and he's uncomfortable with the emotions that interacting with them brings out. But the unfortunate truth in this episode is that Rick needs Unity for the purpose of saving the state of Virginia. And Dr. Wong has to step in just to get Rick to be peaceful and not react with hostility towards Unity. And at the end of the episode, they still don't trust Rick, but it's revealed that they at least care enough about him to have reached out repeatedly and only went to Earth to grab his attention somehow. And to their credit, it did work. And this episode ends with the reveal that Rick didn't even bother listening to the voicemails that Unity sent him. And this tells us that Rick is still constantly avoiding the negative emotions that he associates with the hive mind, a sign of emotional immaturity. But to his credit, Rick actually has grown as a character in this regard. At the end of the first episode with Unity, they dump him and Rick is ready to run away from his emotions by ending his own life. But at the end of this one, the status quo remains unchanged. Unity does not want to be with Rick, and Rick is upset about it, but instead of running away from the negative emotions, he endures them by grabbing some drinks, taking a seat, and playing through the voicemails that Unity sent him. This shows that there is at least some growth on Rick's part, but it's still not significant enough for him to be actually worthy of love, even if the person who would have loved him is a being that deeply cares for him as Unity does. And his whole stint with Unity kind of tells us Rick's main problem when it comes to romance. He's averse to growth, but he's not incapable of it. Because loving someone means change. Attraction is a feeling, but love is a decision. To love another means to choose them and whoever they become, but Rick is incapable of choosing anyone but himself. As attached as he was to Unity, Rick didn't love them. Rick didn't care about their wants. Rick didn't listen to them when they tried to reach out. Rick only cared about his feelings and his desires, and that is not how a healthy person loves another. If he did love Unity, he would have chosen to make an effort to change for them, to at least hear them out when they tried reaching out and went through all of that trouble just to get in contact with him. Instead of choosing to confront his emotions and mistakes and grow from them, Rick chose to stay who he is, a person incapable of loving. But slowly, that is changing. Because for all his nihilism, Rick is a character who still undoubtedly wants romantic love and connection with another person. And I think the main reason for that is that love is fun. Love is enjoyable. It gives you an emotional high that is completely unmatched by any kind of vice. And the best way to illustrate this idea is through the next character that Rick has a romantic fling with on the show, Daphne. Daphne is a one-off character that we meet in the episode A Rick Convenient Mort, known among my friends as the Planetina episode. Here we get a glimpse into the realities of love shown by two different characters, Rick and Morty. Both characters fall in love in this episode, but the circumstances surrounding that love and how they choose to navigate the relationships are completely different. In this episode, Rick and Summer choose to go on an interplanetary bender, hopping from planet to planet right before they meet their apocalyptic end. The idea is that since these planets are about to be destroyed, nothing matters, and they can live in a completely hedonistic lifestyle without any attachment or real consequences. But Rick breaks this with the first alien he makes out with, Daphne. Much to Summer's dismay, Rick insists on bringing Daphne with them as they go planet hopping because he has grown attached to her. And they enjoy each other's company so much that the alien lady even thinks that they're soulmates. But while their relationship is very intense, it simultaneously lacks depth. Rick and Daphne barely talk to each other when they're on screen together. Usually, they're just making out, and Daphne even mentions that the reason why she believes Rick won't leave her is because of her immaculate pair of elbow breasts, which, first of all, ew, but more importantly, it's a very surface-level trait. And that just tells us that Rick and Daphne's relationship is shallow. And yet, Rick has still grown an attachment, even claiming that he's fallen in love. The intensity of their relationship cannot be denied, but truthfully, there is very little actual intimacy between the two characters, because Daphne is under the impression that she's going to die anyway. And when the threat of impending doom is gone, Daphne immediately loses interest in Rick, who had apparently grown attached to her enough to the point where he's actually upset that she's gone. Now, there's nothing wrong with wanting a purely physical, low-stakes, intense relationship. But Rick got attached and was upset that Daphne didn't feel the same way. I think that if Rick really did love her, he could have tried to build a deeper connection with her and try to establish a foundation for a relationship that wasn't just physical attraction, matching sex drives, and the possibility that they may not live to see tomorrow. Rick clearly wanted something more than just an end-of-the-world fling. Maybe if Rick had tried to actually get to know Daphne, she might not have left him immediately once the threat of the world ending had passed. Because while their feelings of attraction for each other were intense, the two were not truly intimate. And we get a good example of what real intimate love looks like in the very same episode with Morty and Planetina. Their relationship is just as intense as Rick and Daphne's, but there's also actual intimacy involved. There's more than just physical attraction at play, as Morty and Planetina get to know each other as individuals and fall for each other because of their shared values. Because Morty and Planetina have established a deeper connection, he gets to enjoy a much stronger high than Rick does. But we also see why Rick might be afraid of having such a bond, because having a deep connection to someone means that you will be hurt should that connection ever be severed. And we see this when Morty breaks up with Planetina over her extremist views. While he may have been the one to end that relationship, that doesn't change the fact that he loved her, and the bond they had was truly special. And Rick, having lost the love of his life, understands this all too well, so we can see why he may be afraid of intimacy. But you can't have the emotional highs of a romantic connection without being prepared to face the emotional lows, because that's just what it means to be known by someone else. And because of Rick's traumatic experience with losing Diane, Rick may be too afraid to love someone so closely again, and that's okay. It is a completely valid and human reaction to not want to love again after heartbreak. But Rick's biggest flaw is that he uses the trauma of his heartbreak as a convenient excuse to not work on the parts of himself that are truly preventing him from falling in love again. Which brings us to BugAnne. And I love how the show utilizes this character in relation to Rick in romance. BugAnne has known Rick for years and has an actual basis for a relationship with him beyond physical attraction, considering they were both revolutionaries. And in the first 2 minutes of the episode, BugAnne just does everything right. She knows that she wants something more with Rick. She doesn't hold him hostage and asks him out to a low-stakes event. She even downplays how important it is, saying that it's just a barbecue and he's just a +1. And in the same conversation, she directly acknowledges Rick's trauma and doesn't pressure him into anything. And even when faced with a maybe, she just continues to have sex with him anyway. BugAnne checked every single box on how to navigate dating someone who has experienced intense loss. And to give BugAnne a chance, Rick decides that the only way to properly do it would be to eliminate his last remaining memory of Diane. After all, Diane is the reason Rick can't fall in love again, right? And at first, it looks like he had the right hypothesis. Rick's enjoying being in the presence of BugAnne's family and is just having a great time, but Rick still makes an offhanded comment after being unfamiliar with BugAnne's culture, and he thrusts himself into a duel with her ex-boyfriend. And the beauty of this scene is that none of it had to do with Diane, because by this time, Diane was completely removed from his memory, so he could no longer escape accountability by blaming the horrible thing that happened to him. And hilariously, during their duel, BugAnne's ex-boyfriend even straight up says that it doesn't seem like Diane was the problem, because she wasn't. It was always Rick. And after he hears this, he yet again runs away and BugAnne ghosts him, because she deserves better. Rick's failed romances were never entirely because of his trauma. While yes, it definitely played a part in it, he still hasn't taken the necessary steps to move on, nor work on the problems that have nothing to do with Diane's death. And I think one of the best examples of Rick being the problem is his relationship with Marjorie. Because when Rick goes on vacation as Ted, he has a romance with a bowling alley owner, Marjorie, and they are happy together. Ted is intimately connected to someone else. And the thing is, Ted is all of Rick's best parts. He's intelligent, friendly, and even has some of Rick's augmentations. Maybe part of the reason Rick has to pull a severance and assume an entirely different consciousness when he goes on vacation is that he knows how broken he is, and for him to experience the sensation of love, it would be easier to just become another person entirely, at least temporarily. But that begs the question, isn't that what working on yourself and addressing your trauma is? Becoming an entirely different person after the trauma you've undergone and not allowing it to control your life anymore? Instead of putting in the emotional labor, Rick thought it would be easier to create an entirely different person and assume their identity. And to me, that just sounds like emotional immaturity and avoiding his feelings. And I think the absolute nail in the coffin, showing that Rick is his own worst enemy when it comes to love, is that a different character has undergone the exact same trauma that he went through. and that is the wife of Slow, Mobius. Uncle Slow was supposed to be a throwaway character. He appears in a single episode and he's killed to show how the Omega device works. But because he was married and he died the way he did, it means that another character went through the same traumatic experience that Rick did. Uncle Slow's wife, whom I will call Mrs. Mobius. While they do follow the same footsteps initially, Mrs. Mobius does find love again. She heals and moves on, but that doesn't mean she forgets Slow. And while everybody deals with trauma in their own way, and I will not take that away from anyone, the fact that another character went through the exact same traumatic event as Rick did and chose a different path shows that he can't keep using his dead wife as a convenient excuse for not being able to love someone else. Because the problem was never Diane. It's Rick. It's always been Rick. And I think that's whack.